Welcome everyone to This is an Intervention and to the third Whataboutery on fashion against capitalism. My name is Monica Titton and I have been invited by my peers and comrades at the radical think tank Warehouse Amsterdam. That's Elisa van Jolen, Femke de Vries and Hanka van der Vet, to sit down with them and our panelists. They are Aïcha Abbadi, Shanzhai Lyric, Chinouk, Filique de Miranda, and Ty Smith. With them, we will explore and discuss critical fashion practices that unfold in non-industrial and non-capitalist spaces. Today, we want to engage in a conversation about the possibilities of the future through an assessment of critical fashion practices of the present. How can practitioners, that's designers, artists, professionals working in fashion or in the creative industries, disrupt the destructive cycle of the fashion industry? What could be ways, strategies, and tools to opt out and to create alternative approaches to fashion? Before introducing the panelists, a few words about myself. I'm a sociologist, fashion theorist, and culture critic, and I teach fashion history and theory at the fashion department of the University of Applied Arts in Vienna. My research is guided by an effort to expand and develop theoretical frameworks for critical analysis of fashion and is informed by the traditions of post-structuralism, Marxism, feminism, and post-colonialism. I consider teaching, researching, and writing as a political, emancipatory, and utopian practice that aims to reshape the future of fashion. My students are my prospering, burgeoning connection to the praxis of fashion design, that is, to the creative and cognitive labor involved in making and designing garments. But I also see them as my peers, and I always ask myself, what will they do with this? What will they do with this theory, with this concept, this knowledge, or this insight? And it is with this intrigued and ever-present question in the back of my mind that I, the curious theorist, enthusiastically accepted the invitation to MC this intervention. Now let me introduce you our panelists. Aïcha Abbadi explores fashion's boundaries and reflects on the discipline itself through theory and practice. She's interested in niche fashion practices and alternative ways of making and being in fashion, as she considers these contributions to be essential for a shift in perspective that interrupts fashion's main narratives. She's also invested in neighborhood initiatives in Berlin that create shared community spaces and foster active participation for creative, culturally, and socially diverse environments. Design researcher and critical fashion practitioner Chinouk Filique de Miranda explores the crossover between the fashion system and digital culture by focusing on introducing digital literacy in fashion. In her practice, she approaches fashion as a subliminal communication vehicle, which she aims to demystify in order to inform consumers on complex matters regarding individual agency within our current digital culture. In her ongoing research project, The Algorithmic Gaze, the digitization of fashion and the new ways the fashion system and its consumers connect and communicate through newly acquired technological rhythms is explored and explained. Shanzhai Lyric is a body of research focusing on radical logistics and linguistics through the prism of technological aberration and non-official cultures. The project takes inspiration from the experimental English of Shanzhai t-shirts made in China and proliferating across the globe to examine how the language of counterfeit reveal the artifice of global hierarchies. Through an ever-growing archive of poetry garments, Shanzhai Lyric explores the potential of mistranslation and nonsense as utopian world-making and has previously taken the form of poetry lecture, essay, and installation. Ty Smith is Associate Professor of Modern and Contemporary Art History and Media Studies at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. She's the author of Bauhaus Weaving Theory, From Feminine Craft to Mode of Design, published by University of Minnesota Press in 2014, and has lectured and published internationally on textile art, design, and theory. She's currently working to complete 2 book manuscripts, one entitled Fashion After Capital, and the other textile media, Tangents from Modern to Contemporary Art. Aïcha, Shanzhai, Lyric, and Chinook will each present their practice in approximately 5 minutes, followed by a historical reflection on fashion and capitalism by Tai. In the following panel discussion, we will discover the interconnection between these 4 positions. And after that, we will open the floor for the Q&A, and so we all get to talk together. You can write your questions in the chat, and if you want to ask your question live, so that means like on screen, we will invite you to contribute. So please say so explicitly in the group chat. And we will have approximately 20 minutes for this Q&A. So you know the drill, please mute your microphones while our panelists speak. Thank you very much. Aïcha, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. I don't know if you can see me. Yes. Okay, so I developed my critical practice over the course of my studies, which I did at the University of the Arts in Berlin. But over the course, I became increasingly more critical of the whole industry and the fashion system, like many before me and who are studying now probably know about. So I went on the lookout for practices where you can participate in fashion with more integrity without, in a way, self-colonizing into the fashion industrial system. And my projects in and outside of the university context started to reflect this. And I started to do installation works that question textile production and kind of greenwashing in the sustainable fashion industry context. And then I thought, how can we participate more equally in fashion instead of a hierarchic top-down system? So I started with some neighbors, some fashion workshops in schools, community centers, and emergency housings, where we did pop-up sewing workshops with all sorts of people who might not be interested in fashion on their own, but with some skill sharing labs and pop-up workshops. There were some very important discussions had about production conditions and the origins of clothes, but also their value. So alongside these, I started an article series at Address Journal, which is edited by Johannes Reponen, which was called Fashion from the Shadows, where I sought to research and dig deeper about these alternative practices, to learn about it for other ways about moving forward, and to also include this in my own practice as well, but to point others towards them and kind of interrupt the main fashion narrative just by providing alternative views on fashion and maybe also connecting practitioners which were previously working in isolated contexts. So in the background, you can see images also of workshops we did with neighbors where we tracked the origins of clothes and did some open air sewing workshop and had some discussions about the working conditions abroad, because a lot of the participants were very young and reflected also on their counterparts elsewhere who were holding these garments in their hands before them. So I think there's a lot more to say, but I believe that I would now hand over the space to someone else who is co-hosting here.
Thank you, Aïcha. Next up is Chinook, Filique de Miranda. The floor is yours.
Yes, do I start my video myself? I think so. Okay, I don't know if people can see me, but so as Monica previously mentioned, my practice, I researched a multitude of implications that are presented by the fashion system and its crossover into digital culture, and with that also the algorithmic governance. So it holds a focus towards gaining or regaining rather digital agency in the online fashion environment and introducing digital literacy in fashion. So introducing ways to decode our visual environment online and the way that it impacts us. So topics in my research often gear towards digital sensory overload, digital identity, fashion's digital visuality, and to an extent also propaganda, the way we curate our own environment and the ways that it leads to a sort of personal bubble, visual bubble. And within this framework, it often boils down to the way that the fashion system and the consumer interact and communicate with each other, and how they condition each other and how they often play up on mystification and how that comes into play with fashion. The idea that we're being sold anything and everything at any moment's notice, and that in the online environment, we as audience have become a commodity ourselves, is a very key point within the research that I often do or in my writing. And the way that this digital, so physical/digital engagement takes place is very important. And through that, I also want to engage with an audience in the same modes of working. So I graduated with a project called the algorithmic gaze, which kind of decodes the visual environment that we digitally orchestrate for ourselves. And to further explore that with an audience, I've had the opportunity also with State of Fashion to host workshops and to kind of critically analyze this environment with an audience. And the dialogue that comes from that is important step to take towards creating awareness around the ability to have agency in a digital environment. So I could go on and on and on, but I think it's time for the next person to introduce their work.
Thank you, Chinook. Next up is Shanzhai Lyric, and that's Alexandra and Ming talking. The floor is yours. Are you there?
Can you see us?
Yes, now we can see you.
Okay, great. Hi, I'm Ming, and this is Alex. Our collaboration began in Beijing in 2015, and for the past 6 years, we've been thinking about the phenomenon that we call Shanzhai lyrics, which is a beautiful, poetic, non-standard English that you often find on fast fashion shirts coming out of South China, and worn pretty much everywhere. So you can see some examples of these shirts in the slides.
Shanzhai is the Chinese word for counterfeit. It literally translates to mountain hamlet and refers to the story of an enclave on the edge of town where bandits stockpile stolen goods from the empire to redistribute among the people. So for us, Shanzhai takes on a spatial capacity. It's both a sanctuary and a stronghold, and it suggests that power can be seized by the margins. The text on Shanzhai garments offers refuge from the dominant language of the fashion industry while also being composed of its overstock.
So back in 2015 in Beijing, we began visiting each day this multi-level women's clothing market called Zoo Market, which has since been demolished, and spent some time with these phrases, thinking about the networks of production, exchange, and distribution, and the poetic mistranslations and mashups that result from the ceaseless churning of fast fashion under our globalized hyper-capitalist system. At that time, we didn't have any money to physically acquire any of the shirts. And this impossibility to purchase the poems really affected how we are thinking about archive in an expanded field.
So one thing we ask is, how can you find intimacy with an object without needing to acquire, buy, or own? And this restriction has guided the practice. We're interested in archives of desire and that as a mode to think about our desire.
So we think of the Shanzhai t-shirt as a liminal object that is both a garment to be worn and a document to be read. We're often archiving poetry garments architecturally, making gathering spaces for out of and for textiles. And these structures play host to translation experiments, conversation experiments, and the structures themselves are inspired by different shapes and frameworks where you see clothes or words typically: runways, scrolls, reading rooms, heaps, closets, stages, laundry lines, and billboards.
So right now we find ourselves in residence at and as Canal Street Research Association. This is a fictional entity that we made up in order to continue our research into so-called counterfeits or fakes. This particular instantiation of our research at Canal Street is the result of both happenstance and economic collapse. This block is considered the epicenter of counterfeit culture in New York. The majority of the storefronts right now are boarded up due to the financial downturn from the pandemic and from the Black Lives Matter protests against police brutality and racial injustice that unfolded in the city last June. So landlords here were afraid of looting, the looting of mostly empty spaces, and our practice here hopes to complicate that conversation around what constitutes looting.
So amidst all of this, we were invited to inhabit one of these empty spaces while being very aware that our presence here is part of an art washing scheme which uses fashion and art to rebrand the neighborhood and upscale and raise the rents. So part of our research here has been to work through the possibility or impossibility of finding ways to subvert a very violent situation that we are always living within, having to rely on it to make any kind of living.
During the pandemic in this largely vacant city, the newly freed up sidewalk space right outside the Canal Street Research Association has allowed street vendors of counterfeit goods to spread out. Yet starting around Christmas time, the police began showing up in unauthorized raids, apparently to do some Christmas shopping for themselves. Often working without the appropriate permits, the street vendors have no recourse. So of course, the real looting here is by the landlords, the fashion corporations, and the police, who continually displace residents and take away the opportunity for anyone to make a living.
So Canal Street Research provides a literal window into the counterfeit market in New York. Shanzhai garments make evident the arbitrariness and artifice and the very real violence of borders and of common assumptions around ownership, property, and theft. Criminalizing the flow of counterfeit goods is a mode of criminalizing the largely undocumented immigrant workforce that makes up the shadow economy, despite the fact that it is the copy that sustains and circulates the image and appeal of the original. It is the so-called fake that gives value to the so-called real. Thank you.
Thank you to Shanzhai Lyric for this presentation. Next up is Ty Smith.
Hi, thanks so much, Monica, and also to Warehouse for inviting me. As Monica mentioned, I'm a historian and theorist and a teacher, so my practice very much occupies that space. But I see it also as a way to intervene in the dispositive systems that surround and define me, including capitalism, but also academia, neocolonialism, etc. So I want to acknowledge that I live actually in Vancouver, Canada, which is on the unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. Now, reading Warehouse's introduction to this intervention, Fashion Against Capitalism, my initial response was one of curiosity, but also a bit of incredulousness. What are these other forms of fashion of which they speak? Could fashion and capitalism really ever be separated? Could an alternative fashion system be created from the ashes of this planetary hell that capitalism has produced? I ask these questions mindful, of course, of my relative ignorance about developments in and around alternative fashion cultures these days. After all, I only just learned after reading the text here about developments in collective and critical practices that have been picking up speed over the last year. And that, as Aïcha notes, and I'm quoting her, following a long period of excess, fashion appears to be finally sobering up. Teetotaling sentiments aside, this is exciting indeed. But I'm also mindful as a historian and theorist who has been studying the nexus between fashion and capital for a few years, that these sociocultural concepts, both of which are products of elaborate human fictions and beliefs about value, have long been imbricated in Western culture. So note, of course, I'll be speaking about the so-called West here, mainly because the role of fashion and capitalism in the global South and in the East have quite different and at times inverse relationships to the fashion capitalist matrix I'll be describing. Anyway, from the perspective of 2021, it may seem like their emergence is a recent 19th or 20th century phenomenon, a byproduct of industrialization and globalization. Or perhaps with the rise of algorithms used in bespoke marketing, we are more aware of the ways that fashion functions as an arm to capital's research and development wing. Fashion, as Chinook suggests, permeates capital like a cloud, like a data service. But of course, some out there may even contend that fashion once existed, long before modernity, without capitalism's noose around its neck. And in some sense, this is all true. But such assumptions lose sight of the fact that fashion's modus operandi, or fundamental method of existence, was adopted by capital several centuries ago. Note that Marx defines capital pithily as, quote, value in motion, which I think would serve just as well for a definition of the fashion system. Capital has been chasing after fashion's movements, after its novelty and trends, since it set its eyes on colonizing the entire world. Fashion has been the means, the vehicle, the driver of capital from the outset. Without fashion, I contend, capital would not exist. So note, this is quite a different argument than the one made by Werner Sombart, that fashion is, quote, the favorite child of capitalism. As Google Ngram suggests, the lineage is reversed. If we are to identify the historical existence and importance of these concepts for Anglophone society, as measured by their percentile weight of the entire Anglo discourse captured by Google Scholar, then fashion's fashionableness hit peaks significantly before capital was mobilized more broadly. And if fashion historically preceded capital, it perhaps parented capital's strivings, its ambitions for novelty. In other words, if anything, fashion was made possible by the economic system known as mercantilism, which was the dominant mode in Europe from the 15th through the 17th century. And capitalism, which really only took off in the mid-18th century with speculative investments and the opening of stock exchanges, was, we might say, born out of fashion. Of course, most modern economists would say that capital in its pure state has nothing much to do with fashion. Or at most, fashion is a tiny microeconomic sector within the far greater world of macroeconomic events. Economists talk about trends and bubbles and stocks like they are aberrant forms, monstrous growths on the otherwise pristine mathematical surface of capital growth. But as the South Sea Company bubble revealed in 1720, or as the recent GameStop bubble reveals, around the time that capital investment in one firm precipitously grew and abated over a year or a week, catching the craze of the British public, capital is always prone to be smitten with fashion. Indeed, both of them follow and produce trends, and they have equally proven to be monstrous. The 1818 cartoon by George Cruikshank, which I showed among my slides, makes this point. They are each in their own but related ways pathological. There is a madness in following them. So although they seem to emerge from disparate realms of thought, ideas about fashion, trends, and cycles have seeped into myriad economic texts from William Petty in the 17th century and Bernard de Mandeville in the early 18th century to Adam Smith David Ricardo, Marx, William Jevons, John Maynard Keynes, and so on. That is from the mercantilists to the political economists, to the marginal revolution, to the neoliberal economists, which is all something I discuss in my book. Fashion is present. Anyway, if fashion has been central to capitalism from the start, how does fashion extricate itself from these bonds? How does it leave the hall or sweatshop of mirrors that capital creates of it? If capital always returns again and again to appropriate fashion's creativity and poetics, its movement and drives, where can fashion hide? What can it do to get capital off its back, to throw off the scent? Perhaps I am somewhat skeptical that these social changes could be separated after 300 years of being mutually constitutive, but I'm also intrigued by the proposal that fashion could do something different, that the specific version of fashion that came into being in Europe several centuries ago among the mercantile and noble classes could truly become what Marx dreamed of, a communist space of creative dialogue. Either way, in order to do this, fashion will need to redefine itself entirely. It will need a new ontology for a new set of practices, a new direction and path, not one based in growth or change for change's sake, but perhaps, as Aïcha and Chinook and Shanzhai lyric suggest, an identity based in relationships of mutual exchange. Indeed, insofar as I brought up the monstrosities of fashion and capitalism earlier, I want to be clear, I am not supporting a virtuous or teetotaling argument against monstrosity in fashion. If anything, there is potential there. To be sure, fashion's excesses result in or coincide with fires, slavery, death, but they also at times push against capitalism's tendency toward efficiency. Excessive fashion will not be streamlined or virtuous, nor will it be entirely vain, but it will continue to build excesses into human relationships. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tai, for this brilliant overview. I'm really impressed. You just completely changed the theory of fashion. I like that Sombart inversion that you just did. Excellent. So thank you, dear panelists, for your presentations and for these insights into your work. I would now like to turn again to our practitioners, if you allow me to say so. And I would like to begin the panel discussion by asking each one of you to tell us about a specific example from your practice, your work, through which you felt that you have achieved a change and how that manifested itself. Alexandra and Ming, maybe you can start. I'm really interested in this residency. And I mean, it's fantastic that you have never heard of a fictional research residency. Can you maybe expand a little bit about the art washing scheme and what you've done?
Yeah. We can even maybe show you a bit of it if our image is clear enough. Yeah, so we're in a disused storefront on Canal Street. This is Canal Street. I don't know if you all can see. It's a heavily trafficked zone, and it was dug out as a sewage route in the 1800s, only to be filled back in when it proved to be a hygiene or sanitation issue. And since then, it's undergone many changes. It has, over the past 10, 20 years or so, become the hub of counterfeit activity, and then kind of subject to various crackdowns from above. And then, but always attracting like quite a lot of tourists. And then during the pandemic, yeah, we saw kind of like the filtering out of most of the shoppers, revealing the kind of activities that have been going on for some time, but maybe were normally obscured and often oppressed by the police force, which are, yeah, these sellers that are coming here, setting up every day, selling fake Louis Vuitton bags, Chanel bags. And yeah, we
We keep looking to the side out the window because the space is literally a big window onto the center of the counterfeit market. And there's a very, I guess, interesting kind of relationship being built over this time here where like a horizontal, a mutually curious gaze where we go across the street to talk to the vendors and the vendors come into the space to talk to us. And we kind of each ask about each other's research and ways of making a living and ways of thinking about counterfeit goods and also art practice, because most of the vendors like sell bags to make a living, but what they really care about is their music practice or their own fashion design or their filmmaking, their spiritual practice. So essentially we've just like taken this pause, this moment of pause to have those conversations in a way we wouldn't have been able to.
But to speak to your question specifically about the art washing, this particular part of the block has I think it was a number of the buildings were acquired by a new landlord in the past, I think like 6 years ago. And they started going through this transition where they wanted to upscale their property. And the way they decided to go about doing that was to bring in artists, to bring in fashion, pop-ups, to basically keep out what had previously been souvenir shops and counterfeit goods shops. And I think to pave the way for longer term luxury tenants. And so we were invited here during pandemic, like free of charge because they couldn't find anyone to fill it, but we're very aware of the fact that we're just a placeholder until they can find either a pop-up, a cultural pop-up or a longer term tenant.
Yeah, so our research here is like trying to figure out if there is any room within that for kind of problematizing the situation, and essentially our experiments have led to our eviction. So we're currently in the process of being evicted and also thinking about that as part of the research and what it means to use that as an opportunity to have face-to-face conversations with the landlords and with our neighbors. So that the eviction itself actually is a new kind of chance for talking through some of these issues.
Very interesting. Thank you. When I saw the images also in your presentation, I noticed the Balenciaga shoes, and somehow I felt that maybe Balenciaga is kind of it's also a Shanzhai lyric or a Shanzhai brand, because they seem to be feeding on that aesthetic. Are you afraid that they might one day co-opt you? Or ask you to, what would you do if they ask you to collaborate?
Well, we actually have been asked to collaborate with some kind of high-end luxury brands in the past. And I think, yeah, we're like very aware of like the kind of tendency that the fashion industry has to cannibalize content. And I don't think it's something we could control. Even, I mean, yeah, we could accept or we could decline, but it's kind of inevitable anyways.
Yeah, so one thing that we think about in terms of redistribution of resources and considering Shanzhai to be like a strategic model is maybe how can you operate in a parasitic way that allows you access to some resources that then perhaps can be redistributed. For instance, in the past, when we have been in these proposed collaborations, we're very aware that if we refuse the collaboration out of a sense of a certain like moral standing, then the corporation will still steal the work, but we will not get any compensation or credit. So it's instead about this negotiation of how can you maybe like get as many resources from the corporation and then find an interesting way to redistribute that or to like welcome as many other people into that collaboration as possible, and to try to like maintain criticality or to turn the situation on its own head in some way, which is a bit what we're thinking through here. Like, is that possible? To what extent is that possible? But I think part of the intensity of this moment of hypercapitalism is that refusal is often not a very effective strategy because the holders of power and resources are not hurt by that actually. So yeah, we're well aware that what you described with Balenciaga is in fact already happening to a great degree. And so within that game, you know, how can you kind of like bend the rules rather than simply like not playing the game as it just continues to grow.
Thank you. We will get back to you maybe later. I see there's many questions popping up in the chat. But I wanted to first go around of questions in the panel and then address the questions directed to you. So next, maybe Chinook, do you want to talk about your work, an example from your work?
Sure. Hi. So yeah, an example of when my practice was most successful, or when I feel like my practice is most successful, is when, especially when people circle back to me with their digital encounters after me, or after I've had either a conversation or after they read my work or we had a workshop or some type of discussion about it. So not by telling me or me telling them how to engage with capitalism in terms of consumption, but them like being triggered by this digital engagement of some sorts, especially because my practice approaches digital culture as a vortex that sucks you into this consumerism by seeing the stuff that you like or fits your identity. So I think the process of creating awareness and then actually seeing the results of that, and then the conversation carrying on its own, for me, feels like I'm being successful in what I'm trying to do with my practice. Because I think, well, during my research for the algorithmic gaze, which in short, the algorithmic gaze explains the algorithm's portrayal of its digital usage landscape, in which its previously determined preferences reach beyond and overtake an objective view of your digital surroundings. But my approach towards this environment was actually by doing an extended case study in which I screen recorded my behavior and then watched it back to just analyze it. And simply by watching just frame to frame, I know nobody in their right mind would really do this in their spare time, but for me, it was really a turning point in terms of the importance when it comes to demystifying this landscape, and that conversations need to be held around this topic. So when this dialogue then really does happen, either as a result of the workshop or in any other type of way, I feel like I've succeeded in either having someone reevaluate their online experience, and by demystifying this subliminal structure that we experience online, that is constructed through algorithms. And I know a lot of people tend to trail off when you use the word algorithm, because it's an empty word that is used very often to also scare people. But laying the groundwork for kind of educating everyone that uses online media on its workings, I think is important. And when you see the result of that, that's, I think, when I'm most successful or feel most successful.
Thank you, Chinook. There's also some questions for you, but we'll address them later. Aisha, maybe you can give us some insights into your practice, further insights into your work.
Yes, well, success is always a loaded word, so
I know, take it with,
yeah. I think what was the most surprising for me was that all of the things I've been doing, there was not necessarily some plan behind it. It all developed kind of organically just from the questions I had and the conversations I had with others. And then I decided to make these conversations and thoughts more public through writing online and printed publications, just to engage also with others and to connect maybe people who didn't know each other before. And I got some feedback through that. Well, we connected through your article and things like that. And maybe that's a great thing that can happen, which is also happening now since we are here. And I knew some of the work before, for example, from Shanzhai Lyric. I came across it last year, I think, and was already around for a while probably. So I was late to the game, but yeah, and also Chinook's work, I had read it before. And so now I'm introduced to fashion after capital. So I think it's about connecting people, which is the most important in whatever way you're doing. And also in these neighborhood workshops, just to change the perspective from some people, perhaps temporarily, but also had this people seeing me in the streets months later and then saying this one day or this weekend course, it changed completely how I interact with my clothes. I take care of them again, or I see it differently. I see the whole context suddenly. And otherwise it's just a detached piece in a shop or somewhere. And yeah, even flea market garments are seen differently now. So I think that's a nice takeaway from all of these endeavors.
Thank you, Aïcha. Tai, I wondered if you can maybe give us a few historical examples of critical creative practices that could be considered models or precursors to what we are discussing here, or just associations that were sparked in your historical mind.
I mean, it's funny because when you kind of indicated to me earlier that you might ask this question, I thought, oh God, you know, what examples can I think of? You know, I rack my brain. And I think I came up with some kind of obvious ones. Of course, in part because this is important to my book project on fashion after capital, is that it concludes with Duchamp, which on the one hand seems like the obvious character to end with, given the sort of model of appropriation that he kind of brought into the world. And one could say did so to the detriment of art, possibly, but also obviously kind of ended up making art very oriented toward fashion, I would say. I think that his intervention was actually in fashion. And of course, I'm not the first person to say that. He wasn't really intervening in the art world, or at least not, he didn't think he was. He was intervening in what he thought was a kind of, I wouldn't say necessarily the fashion system, like the clothing and goods production, but fashion as a way of, as I've been describing, as movement, about time, about speed of change, et cetera, et cetera. And he was in many ways trying to slow things down or put a stopgap, you get a stoppage, like the 3 standard stoppages, like in that system. Which of course I think is definitely relevant to Shanzhai Lyric, to Aisha and Chinook's practices for sure. I mean, that seems to me like an obvious one. You know, is that a good place to go? Do we want to continue that model? I don't know. Does it just end up producing the same thing or doing what Alexandra and Ming were describing, of this like constant reappropriation by capitalism of all of the avant-garde strategies? Possibly, yeah. I mean, it can be a problem, but I think that the redistribution and the community is the way forward. And I think that that's the thing that I find most exciting, this kind of more community oriented, if I say communist, even kind of mode. And I mean communist in the non contemporary political sense, but a more 19th century version of that. And actually another example that I thought of was the camp culture of the mid 20th century, especially in queer culture in New York, especially around, you know, Jack Smith and all of the characters around Warhol's factory who were not, you know, part of the brand, but were kind of at the edges. And they were doing something very interesting in fashion, in part because they were using old, outdated forms of clothing, like going to the, someone mentioned, as Aisha mentioned, going to the you know, flea market, or going to the vintage store, just going into their grandmother's closet, quite literally stealing clothes, repurposing them, and camp as this kind of very radical undermining of the language of fashion, both as something that needs to perpetually change, but also something that is about status, because camp is all about like a kind of undermining of status. So yeah, I think that there are multiple examples. 19th century, you know, was filled with very strange magazines that seemed to kind of support the fashion system, but were also undermining of it in the language. And I could cite some, but I don't have them present for me right now. But they were very they pushed back against the kind of aristocratic vocabulary of fashion as it was in the 19th century, often making fun of it in that very wry English humor kind of way that really like undermined the kind of the hierarchy of, like, say, the gentleman, whom they kind of totally lambast, I mean, like completely undermined in the language of these magazines. So I mean, I think that there are examples, and I'm always kind of heartened because you can find them, but they're in between, and they're never going to necessarily be the thing that you have as most present. I mean, Duchamp obviously, but then he became, as he was held up as this exemplar, he became something else, right? His work and practice became something else, which I don't think was obviously the intention. Like, he said he was the defrocked artist, which I think is, of course, hysterical, right? Like, he had like defrocked like a priest, defrocked, but also like a fashion, defashioned, you know, artist. Yeah, so those are some examples.
Thank you, Tai. I wonder, what do you think about tie-at and the futuristic jumpsuit as a sort of, maybe in its artistic and design language, it can't be placed in the same sort of aesthetic realm where Shanzhai lyric and Aisha and Chinook are moving. But I think the impetus of that was very kind of, it was about operating outside of capitalist fashion production, I guess. And so was also the reform dress movement, you know, in a way. I don't know if that makes any sense.
I don't know about the reform dress movement. I would have to think about that. I feel like it was just kind of another sort of, it kind of paved the way for styles, clearly. But the futurist like costume, or the, you know, constructivist costume, for sure, these uniforms. And of course I can't remember the name of the group that's kind of more of a contemporary version of that, but just what's the name of it?
It's the Reform Dress Society? You mean
is it? Oh no, the contemporary version of the costume, of the uniform worker costume. Anyway,
I don't know.
So maybe someone in the audience knows. But I think that this kind of, actually I have a student who is kind of came up with a proposal as a final project for a website that tracked the uniform in activist cultures, or the use of sort of pieces of clothing like the green scarf in Argentina to kind of give for abortion rights, or, you know, Black Panthers wear and costumes. Those sort of organizational adoptions of certain signifying pieces of clothing. But yeah, I think that there's, I think that, and then the worker costume, right, for the constructivists, and then the futurist costume. I think that it's funny because those really do put stopgaps in the system if they're genuinely taken up, but I think that they just always become just yet another moment in the fashion cycle, and then they get reproduced and readopted. So I'm actually, yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure if I could definitely say that those are strategic methods, right?
Yeah. I saw that Flavia Lo Scialpo wrote in the comments, she says, definitely tayat and the tuta overall, which was a universal garment for both work and leisure. So I think she underlined, I guess, disruptive potential of that project. So maybe, since there's a lot of questions in the chat, which I find really interesting, maybe we can move on to the Q&A. And I think I'd start by going back to a question for Shanzhai lyric that came up earlier. So just give me a second and I can scan it. Okay. Are you ready? Who, in your view, is responsible for facilitating research like yours and making sure value is kept in place? This is a question from the audience to you, Alex and Ming.
Yeah, this is a great question, and it's kind of at the center of our research in some way, as we were discussing before, like how to get access to some of the resources, hopefully to be able to redistribute resources. And the work for us is always moving between different contexts, and this is very important. So we may have the archive in the space of an arts institution, a library, a community center, a gallery, and also someone's personal closet, let's say, or right now in this abandoned storefront. So moving between these kind of public and private spaces, and also publicly and privately funded spaces. So we're very aware of this like delicate dance that one does with funders, essentially, and also yeah, how the audience and the viewer shifts in these different situations. And in some sense, we really prefer to not be in an arts or fashion context, but rather to be fully in a commercial context, and then to frustrate the expectation of the viewer. So for instance, right now, we appear to be a store, but nothing is for sale. So when people come in, they are curious and perhaps confused, and this confusion is what opens up the possibility of both conversation and then quite frequently collaboration, because the assumptions and the language around exchange are being complicated.
Yeah, another thing is like, I mean, we're very interested in the kind of like collective nature of the way in which Shanzhai lyrics are produced. And like one of the, I mean, we generally consider ourselves like in the scheme of this project as archivists, and really the Shanzhai lyrics themselves are the work that have been generated through these different processes that are collaborative and between people and between humans and machines. And so I kind of forgot where I was going with that thread, but yeah, well, anyways, to say that like, who has the responsibility to like, we're trying to create platforms to share these works with others, but it's really open for who, you know, for different viewers, like interpretation.
Thank you. There was a question directed at Chinook. So it says, interested in the way the digital algorithm work, and if there might be potential for colonizing those via tags, etc., the algorithm with fakes. So in a sense, creating maybe Shanzhai algorithms.
Yeah, so kind of like creating a counter movement or confusing the algorithm. In order to confuse an algorithm, you need to know what it thinks about you as a person or how the algorithm identifies you. I think it's definitely possible, but it's not like an on and off switch because it moves through different platforms in which the different paths you take while using online media. So it could vary from Instagram, but also Spotify and email and you just browsing online. They're all interrelated and interconnected. So in order for you to move the algorithm's way of thinking, you need to be able or to open kind of your own movement in terms of stepping outside of your tech bubble, which is a very hard thing to do because when you just live in an environment where you see what you like and you like what you see, it's hard to know what else is out there, but I think it's possible. It's just a muscle that needs to be trained, much like learning how to read by needing to know the alphabet, or in a sense, like it's the same as semiotic analysis by cautiously being able to decode what you see or decoding an image.
So I was wondering, Chinook, where did you get the data for your, so what was your source material?
On which part?
So that this obviously reveals my absolute illiteracy with algorithms, but you must have used something to kind of use, so like you obtained data to make your project.
Yeah, so for kind of my analysis, I used a lot of computational theory, and I referred to rhythm analysis, kind of cross-reference that with the workings of the fashion system, because when it boils down to the bits of it, I'm basically just a nerd, and I really like to know I really like to deconstruct things in order to know how it works. Yeah. And I'm very interested in this digital sphere and just this computational environment that we surround ourselves with. And I asked either people that do the workshop and previously people that I surround myself with, so friends and family, to as a case study kind of record their own screen behavior and scrolling behavior. So that was my starting point, and then I kind of broadened it from that point on.
And so you reap the data trails that they left and recompose them to kind of...
Yeah, so I kind of deconstruct, categorize, and then reconstruct in order to see where the overlaps are, which is it's a pretty tedious process, but it's because you do it manually, very aware of what you're seeing, instead of like applying or utilizing another algorithm or a calculator to categorize the information for you. So I really lay out all the data and then manually check what it's saying or how it's moving, how it's behaving, where the cross references are.
Okay, wow, that's fascinating.
Someone is raising their hand. Is that? I don't know how it works.
We can't really scroll through the. Do you want to, Ilak, do you want to just ask the question?
Maybe just type it or something. Yeah.
Type it in the chat because it's easier, I think. Or ask it live. Just unmute and show your, like turn on your camera. Hi. We can't hear you.
Oh, there. Okay. So I'm just loving this. I think it's absolutely fascinating, and I wonder if are you sort of trained in this in what you're doing? Have you been collaborating with anyone to sort of deconstruct these algorithms, or what's your practice like? 'Cause I think it's really a powerful possibility. I mean, I'll just give one example. There was this is a couple of years ago, but there was someone at I think at Pratt in New York who came up with a way of attaching fake cookies to your own account. So essentially it would muck up what they were tracking. So you would be looking at, like, you know, Star Wars underwear, and you weren't looking at Star Wars underwear, but it thought you were. So essentially all your ads would basically be targeted for a persona that didn't actually exist. So this was just some students' art project. But I just wonder if that's something, are you doing it all on your own, or are you collaborating with someone to work on this?
So at the beginning, so the theoretical part I did on my own, but the gaining insight in how I could either categorize or subvert the algorithmic gaze. I had a lot of talks with either programmers or application builders or user experience designers, and it always was the most interesting conversation to have, because they are so focused on a different aspect of creating this environment. They're focused on making it work and making kind of just ways for obtaining your attention, but not in the aesthetical form, really in the kind of almost utilitarian form of you using a device. And so to have that conversation and to kind of hear them come up with ways that the aesthetic environment can be improved and even more impactful, it was kind of scary, but also gives a little insight into the way that they think about it. But it's a very interesting example that you post, because I think that might be also a fun start for people that play with their algorithm and to get acquainted with it, which is, I think, at the base of trying to understand complex structures.
Thank you. I would like to read a question that was asked to all of us in the panel. It says, do you believe that meaningful fashion criticism can come from inside the industry, or can deconstructing capitalism in fashion only come from without? I guess that's from outside. What advice do you have to people currently working in the machine of fashion, making of the new, on peeling off its tentacles? XOXO, a sad garment worker. Aïcha, maybe you want to start answering that question?
Well, yes. I think for critical fashion writing, already a lot is changing, since it has sadly become also a bit of a trend. So it's capital using it to sell more. So I sadly forgot the name of the article, but there was a very critical fashion article on Vogue Business lately. So I have to find it again. But so this is also taking place in industrial structures already, which is also kind of a new development and also willingness to change and reflect. But for practitioners, it's probably a bit more, it takes a bit more effort, because it needs a reshifting of the whole thinking of how it operates. It means if you are a graduate or a young designer, maybe don't take unpaid interns. It's as easy as that, but it's still very common. So hire if you can pay. And also form cooperatives with others. It's not that difficult. It happens a lot in the art world. you need a few people, it takes some paperwork, but it can be done. And also just reach out for collaborations, which are not only focused on the mutual profit making, like your followers for my followers, but maybe more centered around the shared values that you want to communicate with the world. And there are definitely publics for all of that, because it's not there yet and people are hungry for it also. So it's not something that will vanish somewhere as well. It's not going to be niche if there is no main system. Mm-hmm. It's going to be a variety of different systems and ways of operating next to each other. So I think another question was also like, if our practices are successful, how would this change then as well? So perhaps also in the case of Shanzhai Lyric, also the whole shopping experience would also be involve these critical conversations and also seeing everything more in relation to the global context and interacting with storekeepers maybe in a different way. Mm-hmm. And making it not only a transactional experience, but one of mutual learning, or I don't know how you would express this. And mm-hmm. also in Chinook's practice to revert processes, because it's also habit building. There are whole courses in Stanford or wherever just build about how to make people addicted to habits. So, and also positive habit building, whatever. So, but these can also be reverted. So reversed fashion habits, and how could these take place, and just engage more consciously, I guess, with the whole process of getting dressed and choosing and tending to garments.
Mm-hmm. Alex and Ming, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, the only thing that I want to add, it's very exciting to be in conversation with you all around this, is maybe part of the answer that comes to mind to me is that there is not as much distinction between inside and outside as we think, which is not to flatten out the difference within people's experiences and relation to the various structurings of distribution and production networks, but rather that we're all kind of inside this system, right? So mm-hmm. I think like the myth of trying to be outside can sometimes obscure the possibilities of working with the materials of your situation, right? So for instance, a lot of the garments that we're interested are being made, let's say, in the same factories as the so-called authentic or original, but after hours. So what does it mean to like work with the very materials that you find yourself intimately in contact with? I think that's a really exciting generative possibility, and actually the only one available to any of us, right? Because we're all, if we're living in the world together, entangled in these structures, you know. So that's what we would offer.
Okay. Chinook, do you have anything to add for the sad garment worker? I love that.
I think poor sad garment worker. Yeah, I'm thinking if what Shanzhai Lyric just said, if there's really a distinction between inside and outside, but I think so in terms of how they communicate. But I think it's, for me, for my practice, or from my perspective and experience, like trying to do this from the inside will never work. Trying to do it from the outside, you still have to be aware of being metaphorically eaten by the inside. So I mean, it's a really hard question, but in order for it to change, I think the whole system needs to change, and like reverting back to what Aisha said, it's I think it needs to be like democratized islands for it in order to really change, that work together but also work separately, instead of just actually being one big group working towards the same cause, which is profit. So,
Tai, can I ask you something? You said earlier that, so you spoke about the 19th century and about fashion and mercantilism. So do you think that there's something that can be recuperated from the sort of 19th century mercantilism, or the way that at some point the fashion industry was based also on sort of national textile industries? Do you think there's something to neoliberal globalization and offshoring that is particularly harmful, and that can maybe be part of a solution if parts of sort of neoliberal structures are reversed or eliminated? Because there's also a question, I'm asking this because there's a question from the state of fashion to us, because it's fashion against capitalism. How would the system look that would emerge if your practices are successful? So if there's an economic system that would emerge if these practices were successful, do you think it would include elements of 19th century capitalism, of mercantilism, of social economies, social market economies?
So mercantilism is earlier than the 19th century. It's like 17th century, 16th century, 15th century. I don't necessarily think, I don't want to idealize that, only because, of course that coincides with a lot of the kind of colonizing of the New World and the trade of African slaves on like the ships that carried cloth and slaves at the same time. So this is not, it's not to say, it's just to kind of historicize capitalism, is that capitalism is a historical phenomenon. And it's, in fact, obviously, as any historian of capitalism would say, it's also kind of gone through several phases itself. And it has evolved, obviously, as you've said, like you have now with globalization, or increased, I should say, globalization, and the neoliberal economy has kind of shifted the way that things are produced. And now, as Chinook points out, the way that they're bought or marketed or anything. It's hard, I mean, it's hard for me to kind of speculate on a different economic system because I'm not an economist. Like I can't really speak in those macro ways, but I do feel like what we're witnessing and kind of experiencing in the last several years with social media and et cetera, is this fracturing of the system. It's been happening. It's why big fashion houses are struggling. It's, things are moving away from centralized nodes. So for good and for bad, again, you can't really predict where this is going to lead. And there are some advantages and disadvantages if you're wanting to kind of break away. What my only kind of, I feel, maybe I sound like a bit of a curmudgeon here, but I feel like that the only way to get away from fashion is to redefine fashion entirely. That fashion, insofar as it is about change, and I can't kind of see it as other than that, and maybe I'm wrong, but its ontology is about, value in motion, right? Like capital. How do you rethink or redefine what fashion is? And I feel like some of the examples that have been provided here really are pointing in that direction. So my sense is that what is great about this experience is that we can kind of come together and start to kind of collectively rethink that definition in order to challenge its appropriation by capital, because the way it's defined now, as I've suggested, is, and the way that it's kind of viewed and functions within culture is so susceptible to being just readopted and re-eaten and re-eaten and re-eaten and re-masticated and reabsorbed again and again. And I mean, I just, so that's where I'm completely the curmudgeon. Like, I don't think it's going to happen. So anyway, I don't think that mercantilism was just to go back to that, I don't think that that was a better model.
Yeah. Yeah,
maybe slightly better, but
yeah, but maybe
I mean,
like structures of making and I don't know, I'm just wondering.
I mean, they were more obviously, like, the structures of making for the poor garment worker was more localized, but also problematic in many other ways. And the kind of, the 18th century is kind of known as like the great consumer revolution, because you had all of a sudden people who were kind of so-called at the bottom of the sort of economic class hierarchy suddenly having access to goods in a way that they had never had access to before. And that was considered at that time a very positive thing, because it was no longer that just the nobility had access to this material, but it was also something, and that was actually seen as an advantage that capitalism introduced. This is why Adam Smith is such a proponent of it, because he's like, oh, this is so great. All these people suddenly, the poor or whatever, have not just bread, but maybe a little bit of mutton too, or whatever, because it's become cheaper for them to get these things because of free trade. So, I mean, I think that there are certain, I don't know. I mean, I've become like, also like, I mean, are there advantages to capitalism that we don't want to lose? Sometimes, I mean, I realize we're, we always think of it as this big bad, wolf in the room, but there are certain things that it's done that, and continue to do, which could be good, except the only one, of course, caveat to that being that it's totally devastating the planet. So that's the one thing that we just can't abide.
Yeah, I think I'm trying to ask this question because I think, as I said earlier, always about my students and about them graduating from fashion school, and then not all of them can sort of afford not to get a job after that. And if they have a degree in fashion, will they, like, what is their choice now? Is there any way to kind of get a job in this system and try to change it from within? Like, that's the sort of guerrilla thought that I have. And what is it then that you have to change? And if we are like anti-capitalist, then maybe it's good to be specific what precisely we are against. Are we basically against anybody making profit? Are we against novelty? Of course, we are against the exploitation of labor and sort of the planet. But are we against goods circulating in an economy? Is that how far anti-capitalism goes? I think it's quite important to be kind of specific. So if we're talking about the economy today, it's insufficient to say capitalism because it's neoliberal capitalism. And that is a specific set of decisions that were made in the late 70s and early 80s, and that have led to very specific transformations on a global scale that involved also the fashion industry and the textile industry, which they are connected to each other. Like, the capitalist economy and the fashion and textile industry are intertwined, but they can also be analytically separated. And then perhaps from that, alternatives could be thought of. So we have a couple of minutes left. I wanted to bring in our comrades from Warehouse. Hanka, you and I have been talking a lot about the crucial role of fashion education. Maybe do you want to ask your question now? Sorry.
I will definitely ask my question. Also, it's going to be an open-ended question, like this whole discussion is, because it's a very complex one. But as I also work in education, and other Warehouse team members as well, so Femke and Elisa as well. So in relation to our topic of fashion against capitalism and the topic of industrial fashion, I think it's important to also reflect on the role and the responsibility of fashion education within this context. Specifically, the dominance of Western fashion education, which is seen as a sort of holy grail and the gateway to certain jobs. And within that education, the role of the fashion designer as the genius, and specifically the genius individual, and not fashion as a collective process. So I would love to hear the practitioners and Tai as well to speak a bit about that topic.
Who wants to start?
Yes. So I think this is also changing now, at least in the public fashion schools, because I think there's still a differentiation between public and private fashion schools in how they approach the profession of a fashion designer, and how do you say, how realistic they project it also for the, because we have to talk about different means also of people who study in the different institutions. Perhaps in one fashion school, we talk about multinational firms, and in others, we talk about somebody opening a shop in their hometown. Yeah. So this is also very different. There are different ideas of what it means to be a fashion designer, depending on who is having the conversation. And I think what is reflected to the outside, it's more the communication to the outside, because there are whole offices who are trying to get customers for fashion schools, of course. So they have to project an image to draw them in. And this is also capitalist neoliberal education. Mm-hmm. It doesn't only happen in fashion, it's for all sorts of courses. This is the best place to study this. There are rankings. This is the amazing job you will have afterwards. So these are sales tactics. And it's not necessarily what is afterwards what is taught. So perhaps afterwards, after this step, there is a more differentiated portrayal of work in fashion. And it's also changing a lot. There have been a lot of conferences of fashion educators who are trying to also reframe their courses. So there's definitely things happening there. But I think it's not happening yet in the creation of businesses and collectives that operate otherwise. So what I have seen also from my former classmates and other people I've talked to is that there's only 3 choices, kind of dropping out, becoming more of an artistic practitioner, or completely consciously, willingly subjecting yourself to this system. You know that it's bad, but still there's no other way. Or then, as was said before, operating within the system to change it. But I'm not sure that's how it works. I think it's more of a ping pong game of critical practitioners and people who just try to do other things, and then the established businesses and systems, they become aware of it, of course, and then maybe they incorporate some aspects of it, and then the culture changes slowly. But I think it's not a matter of going to into this big company as one small cog in the machine and telling them what to do, because it will need an outside reference. So there have to be enough outside references for the system to be able to change.
Mm-hmm. Who else wants to chip in?
Well, I think that was a very elaborate answer already and very all-encompassing, but just I think in order for the education system, and especially the practical fashion education system, to change, fashion, or the option needs to be given to approach fashion as a product, so making collection, but that fashion, so fashion can be approached as a product or through collections or through making, but fashion can also be approached as a form of research, so research through making. And I don't think that the aspect of researching through clothes or through making is part of a lot of curriculums that I've experienced or that I know about right now. And I think that's an important step to take in order to view fashion differently, because I do think in order for a system to, for this system to change, it needs to create its base at or within the education system or within young academics.
And we would also just add maybe, two things to this conversation. We don't work so much within the educational system as such, meaning the university system, although we do sometimes visit classes and lead workshops. But we do lead more informal, you could say, workshops. And specifically, we've been really interested in our work. I'm wearing a Shanzhai lyric shirt right now of translating and mistranslating the text that is produced with these variety of forces within the counterfeit market. So these, and our installation spaces, or for instance, the Canal Street Research Association that we're in right now, is also this educational opportunity, very much. That's how we conceive of it, right? Because the way that things are installed here invites a viewer to engage and actually to alter the space themselves. And in this moment of interaction, for instance, we ask people to write on the wall their own memories and desires of what the block was and of what the block could be. And we invite them to like touch, rearrange, and wear the garments themselves. There's then this one-on-one conversation that can happen, and really like digging into issues of looting, theft, property, ownership, the status of undocumented workers, that people's assumptions and prejudices around these terms and circumstances can really kind of be unpacked in the one-on-one interaction that a spatial embodied encounter can enable. So this is a sort of like, you know, outside but also inside, I suppose, approach.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm not in the education system that is fashion, the fashion education system. I used to work at an art and design school, first in Maryland, and second in Maryland, first in New York at Parsons, and I remember teaching a lot of fashion students then. I can say that just from the perspective of my, I guess now, I don't know, 15 or so year career as a professor or teacher, I've seen a tremendous shift among students in terms of their intentions, in terms of their knowledge about the system, in terms of their criticality. When I first started, or maybe I can say like as a grad student, I was just kind of like, everyone is so apathetic. They don't care. And in the last, 15 years, the shift has been like, everyone cares and they are motivated. But education takes a long time, right? And you can't predict where this is going to go. And so, I mean, I guess, and this is me, the optimist, right? Like, I think that it takes time, but I can see the wheels turning. And I mean, my daughter, who's 12, knows about this stuff through TikTok, which is like incredible, right? She was woke before she ever had a conversation like, with her friends in grade 7. Like, it's amazing, like how much there's been a shift. And I suspect that what this will generate for Gen Z and going forward is a very different system and new and innovative ways of thinking and working and adapting, as everyone has already described. So actually, I think, education can't be overlooked. It's actually really critical to this. Because it will kind of lead to new possibilities.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tai, for this optimistic outlook. I would add as a concluding thought to your question, Hanka, that the fact alone that we are having this conversation on Zoom, powered by you, like this radical think tank that publishes really avant-garde and I find groundbreaking research and practice on this, with many other examples that have been quoted, like Modo's and the work that Aisha does, and the work that Chinook does, and the work that Shanzhai does. Shanzhai Lyric does. This already testifies to the fact that there is enough critical mass for the system to slowly change. Like, I'm both an optimist and like a proto-communist. So I always believe in the future and I always look towards the future, and I'm always optimistic. And I know that the designers listening, they will find ways. There will be some who will subvert the system from within. There will be some that will do their own things, that maybe will find new ways also of kind of using the commons as a structure, or sort of even change the production system of fashion. So I'm for one really an optimist by choice and by political conviction. So with that, I would like to thank you for your contributions to this panel talk, and also thank you to State of Fashion and Impact Hub for making this event possible. Thank you for René van der Heuk and the team of State of Fashion for your support. And thank you to Warehouse Amsterdam for curating this intervention and for inviting me. It's a real pleasure, and I hope this like group of people are going to maybe meet one day.
Yeah.
And thank you also to the audience for your questions, for your interests. Please also make sure to check the website of State of Fashion for information about upcoming events.